There is a kind of forgetting that isn't forgetting. I didn't know that until I was an old man with a crowbar in my hands, standing in front of a wall I had never seen before in a wing of the fortress I'd never had cause to enter, and yet knowing in my hands, in my stomach, in the cold root of me, exactly what was behind it before I'd pried a single stone loose. That's where I have to begin. Not with the wall, with the knowing. With the moment I understood that I knew a thing I had no memory of knowing, and that the not remembering had been a choice my own mind made long ago to keep me able to live. My name is Vale. I was a guardsman of the fortress of Alkmaar in the kingdom of Tarn for the better part of 40 years, and for most of those 40 years I believed I was a good man. That belief is the thing this story takes apart. I want you to understand, before I tell you what I found behind the wall, that I am not telling you the story of a villain who always knew he was a villain. I'm telling you the story of a man who built a good life on top of a buried thing, who genuinely, completely believed himself decent, who'd have told you with a clear eye that he'd never done real harm to anyone, and who was right about everything except the one thing his mind had walled off so he could go on believing it. The most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell others. They're the ones we wall up inside ourselves so well that we forget we ever told them, and then build a whole honest-seeming life on top of the wall and call ourselves good and mean it. I found out what I was at 61 years old with a crowbar in the lower east wing, because the fortress was being made over and an old wall had to come down. That's the whole of how it happened. No grand reckoning, no enemy revealing my crime, just renovation. Just an old wall in the way of a new doorway, and an old guard sent to help bring it down, and a thing behind it that had been waiting 40 years for me to come back, patient as stone, to make me remember the man I actually was under the man I thought I was. Let me tell you about the man I thought I was, because you have to have him whole before I break him. I was, by the time of the wall, the old steady one, the one the young guards came to, the keeper of the fortress's long memory. 40 years in one place makes you a kind of living record. I knew every stone of Alkmaar, every name, every old story. I'd seen 4 lords of the fortress come and go. I'd trained 2 generations of guardsmen. I'd buried friends and made new ones and become, in my late years, a sort of grandfather to the whole garrison. They trusted me. That's the thing that's hardest to set down. Knowing what I know now, they trusted me completely. The young ones, the Lord himself, everyone, because I was visibly, reliably decent. The old guard who'd never wronged a soul, who broke up fights and counseled the hot-headed and stood every watch he was given for 40 years without a single mark against him. I was proud of that clean record. I'd polished it like armor. 40 years and not one thing on my conscience, I'd have said, and I'd have believed it, and the believing was so total that it had become the whole foundation of who I was. Vale the decent, Vale the steady, Vale who could be trusted with anything. And under all of it, walled up, forgotten, was the thing I'd done. Not forgotten the way you forget a name. Forgotten the way a body walls off a wound it can't survive feeling, sealed, plastered over, built around, so completely that the sealing itself was sealed, so that I didn't even have the memory of having a thing to forget. I'd done the burying so young, you see. I'd been young when it happened, barely a guard at all, and a young mind is good at walling things off. A young mind will do anything to keep being able to like itself, and mine had done the most thorough job a mind can do. It had taken the thing I did and bricked it up so deep that the man who walked around for the next 40 years genuinely did not know it was there. I wasn't lying when I called myself decent. That's the horror of it. I believed it. The lie was buried below where belief reaches. I want to be careful here telling it because it would be easy to make myself sound better than I was, to say I was tricked, I was young, I was ordered. All of that is true and none of it is the point. The point is what I did and what I made myself forget and what it did to me to remember. So let me stop circling and go to the wall. The 40 years, the life built on the wall, and the small signs I never read. I want to go back over the 40 years, the life I lived on top of the buried thing, because looking back now I can see the signs I couldn't see then. The small leaks from behind the wall that I never read as leaks, and they're worth setting down, because they're how a buried thing speaks when it can't be remembered. I told you I became the decent one, the steady one, the grandfather of the garrison. What I didn't understand until the wall came down is why. Why I was so driven to be good, so relentless about it. Why I couldn't pass a young guard in trouble without stopping. Couldn't see a child mistreated without my whole body going rigid with a fury I couldn't explain. Couldn't bear, above all things, the sight of anyone confined, imprisoned, shut away. I'd thought these were just my nature, the marks of a decent man. They weren't my nature. They were the wall leaking. They were the buried boy reaching up through 40 years of stone, making me, without my knowing it, spend my whole life trying to be the opposite of what I'd been that night. Trying to protect every child and free every prisoner and counsel every frightened young guard because some part of me that couldn't remember the boy was trying, desperately, blindly, for 40 years, to undo him, to make up for him, to be good enough to outweigh a thing I didn't know I'd done. There was a thing I did every year that I never understood. Once a year on a night in autumn, I never knew why that night, it had no meaning I could name, I'd be unable to sleep. Would get up and walk the fortress, restless, heavy, grieved by nothing I could point to. And I'd always, without deciding to, end up walking the upper corridors above the lower east wing, walking back and forth above the sealed dead wing, not knowing why, a heaviness in me like morning, and then toward dawn it would pass and I'd go back to bed and not think about it. 40 times I did that, 40 autumns. And I understand now that the night was the anniversary, that my body kept the date my mind had buried, that once a year the buried boy pulled me up out of sleep to walk above his grave and mourn him without knowing I was mourning, without knowing he was there, without knowing anything except a heaviness I'd learned to wait out. The wall held in my mind, but the boy still reached through it once a year and walked me above his bones, and I never once knew, what the autumn restlessness was. It was him, it was always him, calling the only way a walled-up thing can call, through a heaviness with no name, up through 40 years of stone. I tell you this because it's the thing that frightens me most, looking back, not the crime I can at least face now, but the way the crime lived in me unremembered, the way it shaped my whole life from behind the wall without my ever knowing it was there. I thought I was a free man making good choices. I was a haunted man being driven by a buried boy to spend his life atoning for a thing he couldn't remember. My decency wasn't freedom, it was symptom. Every good thing I did was the buried boy's hand on me, and I never felt the hand. I only felt the goodness and called it mine and was proud of it, and it was his all along, his and the wall's, the long blind atonement of a man running from a thing he couldn't see. That's what a buried thing does. It doesn't go away because you've walled it. It runs your life from behind the wall and lets you think you're the one choosing. I was not the one choosing. The boy was for 40 years, and I never knew his name. The lower east wing of Alkmaar was old even by the fortress's standards, a part that had been closed off in my own lifetime, sealed and disused for decades, the kind of dead wing every old fortress has, where nothing happens and no one goes. When the new lord decided to open it up, to make use of the space, I noted it at the time and thought nothing of it. I felt a reluctance to go there that I couldn't explain. Just a heaviness, a not wanting, when they assigned me to the work crew for the lower east. I put it down to old bones not wanting new labor. It wasn't old bones. It was the buried thing, stirring, feeling me come near it after 40 years, the way a sleeper stirs at a sound. But I didn't know that. I just felt heavy and went anyway because you go where you're assigned. We worked through the dead wing for days, opening sealed rooms, hauling out decades of dust and dark, and all the while the heaviness in me grew, the not wanting, and I couldn't say why, and I didn't try very hard to, because a man doesn't examine a vague dread, he just carries it. And then we came to the wall. It was in a corridor of the lower east, a stretch of wall that didn't match. That's the first thing the master builder noticed, not me. He had the eye for it, a section of wall, perhaps 8 feet of it, that was newer than the wall around it. Different stone, different work. A patch where someone had, at some point, walled up what had been an opening. The builder marked it for taking down because the new doorway he was planning wanted to go roughly there, and an old walled-up opening is the easiest place to put a new one. And he set me and another man to bringing it down, because it was newer work and would come apart easier than the ancient stone around it. And when I stood in front of that mismatched patch of wall, crowbar in hand, the heaviness in me became something else, became a roaring, became a dread so total that I nearly couldn't lift the crowbar, my hands gone cold and useless, my heart slamming, and I stood there in front of a perfectly ordinary patch of old walled-up wall, having the worst feeling of my entire life and not knowing why, not having the faintest idea why a stretch of stone should fill me with horror. And the other man asked if I was well. Old man, you've gone gray. And I lied and said it was nothing, the dust, and I lifted the crowbar because what else could I do? I couldn't explain a dread I didn't understand, and I set the crowbar to the wall, and I began to pry. The first stone came loose, and the smell came out, and the smell is what started the wall in my mind coming down with the wall in the corridor. It was a closed-up smell, the smell of a space sealed a long time, stale air and old stone, but under it, faint, almost gone after 40 years but not gone, was another smell, and the other smell went into me like a key into a lock I didn't know I had and turned. I can't describe the smell itself. It was almost nothing, a trace, the ghost of a smell. But what it did was not nothing. It threw me. Standing there with the first stone in my hands, I was suddenly not 61. I was 22. I was young, and it was night, and I was somewhere I'd been before. And the smell was the smell of that night, of that place. And my mind, which had walled this off for 40 years, felt the wall crack at the smell of it and began, against my will, against 40 years of not knowing, to remember. I want to tell you how memory comes back when it's been buried that deep, because it's not the way ordinary remembering works. It doesn't come as a story, in order clear. It comes the way water comes through a cracked dam, first a seep, a wrongness, a single image with no context, and then more faster, the crack widening, the images coming harder, and you stand there with your hands full of stone trying to hold back 40 years of walled-up water, and you can't. It comes. It comes whether you will it or not. The first image that came was a small one, a child's shoe. Just that, a small shoe on stone in lamplight with no story attached, floating up out of the dark of me. And I didn't know why a child's shoe, and I pried another stone loose to have something to do with my shaking hands, and the smell came stronger, and more images came. And the other man working beside me, I have to mention him, because his ordinariness is what made my horror so private and so total. The other man was just working, just prying stones, whistling something, untroubled. To him it was a Tuesday and a wall. And beside him an old man was coming apart at the seams, was watching 40 years of buried memory pour up through a crack in his own mind. And the other man didn't notice, because the catastrophe was entirely inside me, invisible. A whole life ending silently in a man's face while another man whistled and pried stones a yard away. That's how the worst things happen, I've learned, privately, inside. While beside you someone whistles and the day goes on, ordinary, unknowing, and you alone stand in the wreckage of yourself that no one else can see. I pried and I remembered, and I'll tell you what I remembered, but I have to do it the way it came to me, in pieces, out of order, because that's the only honest way to tell a thing that came back in pieces. The shoe first. Then a sound, a child crying, far off, muffled. The sound I'd later understand had been coming through this very wall 40 years ago. Then hands, my own young hands, doing something, setting stones, and the horror starting to take shape as I understood what my young hands had been doing. I had built this wall, or helped build it. My own hands 40 years ago had set these stones, the stones I was now prying loose, and behind them, when I'd set them, behind them had been. I stopped. I had to stop. I stood with the crowbar hanging from my hand and the wall half open and the memory half returned, and I understood, all at once, in a wave of horror that nearly put me on the floor, that I was not bringing down a strange wall. I was bringing down my own wall. A wall I had built with my own hands, 40 years ago, around something on someone's orders, in a night I had spent 40 years not remembering. And the not remembering had let me bewail the decent for 40 years. And now the wall was coming down and taking veil the decent down with it. And behind it was the thing I'd walled up, the thing that was the truth of what I was. And I did not want to see it. I would have given anything not to see it. And I could not stop myself from prying loose the next stone. And the next, because some things, once they start coming back, will come all the way back whether you can bear them or not. The flood, the memory coming all the way back, the night relived in full. I gave you the memory assembled and in order, but I have to give you the flood too, the actual experience of 40 years of buried memory coming back through a crack, because the experience was its own catastrophe separate from the content, and an identity collapse lives in the experience as much as the facts. It came in waves, standing at that wall, and each wave took more of me. First the shoe, I told you, the small shoe with no context. Then the crying far off muffled, the sound through stone. Then my own young hands setting stones. And then, as I kept prying, unable to stop, the waves came faster and bigger and started bringing not just images but the feelings attached to them. The buried feelings, 40 years old, perfectly preserved behind the wall the way the bones were preserved. And the feelings hit me harder than the images because feelings can't be looked at from a distance. They just flood you, become you. And suddenly I wasn't an old man remembering. I was a young man reliving. I was 22 again, and the fear of that night was my fear again. Fresh, total, the terror of the hard Lord, the desperation to obey. The sick wrongness in my gut that I'd felt even then and overridden. All of it back, all of it now. Flooding a 61-year-old man standing in a corridor until I could not tell which man I was. The old one in the corridor or the young one at the wall, the two of me collapsing into one across 40 years. And the boy's face, that was the wave that took the most. As the memory completed, I saw his face again, not as an image now but as a presence, the small face watching through the shrinking gap as we built the wall. And I felt again what I'd felt then and buried. That I'd looked at that face, I'd met the boy's eyes as I set the stones, I had seen him see me sealing him in, and I had not stopped. That was the thing under everything, the deepest stone, the one I'd buried hardest. That it wasn't faceless, that I hadn't sealed an abstraction, that I had looked a frightened child in the eyes and continued to wall him into the dark. That there had been a moment, a specific moment, where his eyes had found mine through the gap, pleading, not understanding, and I had looked away and set the next stone. The looking away, that was the thing. 40 years of forgetting had been built, first and deepest, over the looking away, over that one moment of meeting a child's eyes and choosing the stone over the child. And when that wave hit me in the corridor, it took my legs. I went down. I knelt in the rubble of the wall I was destroying, and I made a sound I'd never made in my life. The sound of a man meeting the worst thing he ever did. And the other man came running back at the sound and found me on my knees and thought I'd taken ill. And I had. I had taken ill. I'd taken ill 40 years before and was only now feeling the fever of it, the fever that had been waiting behind the wall. I knelt there and I lived the whole night again, start to finish. The order, the building, the boy's face, the looking away, the last stones, the muffled crying fading, the walking away, all of it, in one flooding unbearable wave. 40 years of buried night pouring back into a kneeling old man in a corridor, while another man stood over him not knowing he was watching a soul come apart. And when it had all come back, when there was no more behind the wall, when I'd remembered every last stone of that night, I knelt in the rubble emptied and ruined and finally, fully, knowing. And the knowing was the end of the man I'd been. And I understood that I would never stand up from that corridor as Vale the Decent, that Vale the Decent had died on his knees in the rubble, and that whoever stood up would be someone else, someone who knew, someone who could never not know again. It came back whole in the end, standing there, and I'm going to give it to you whole now, the way it finally assembled itself, even though it didn't come to me in order, because you need it in order to understand it, and I've had years now to put the pieces in their places, years I'd give back if I could to not have them. 40 years ago I was 22 and new to the guard, and the fortress of Alkmaar then was held by a different lord, the old lord, the grandfather of the one I served at the end, a hard man, a frightened man, ruling in a hard, frightened time, the kingdom of Tarn torn by one of its periodic dynastic wars, claimants and counter-claimants, the bloody arithmetic of who had the right to rule. And in that war there had been a child. There is always a child. I've learned that much about the wars of kings. Somewhere underneath every grand dynastic struggle there's a child who's inconvenient, a child whose existence is a problem to the people fighting over thrones, and the child pays. This child was a claimant's son, a small boy, the son of a rival to the old lord's chosen side, a boy whose bloodline made him, even at 5 or 6 years old, a piece on the board, a living claim that the wrong faction might one day raise as a banner. The old lord of Alkmaar had captured this child, taken him in some action of the war, some raid. The details never reached a young guardsman like me. And the child was held in the fortress, in the lower east wing. And the question of what to do with an inconvenient claimant's child was the kind of question hard, frightened lords in hard, frightened times answer in hard, frightened ways. They didn't kill him. I have to say that because for 40 years the buried memory had let me imagine, in the rare moments anything stirred, that whatever the half-felt wrongness was, at least it wasn't the worst thing. And it wasn't the worst thing quite. They didn't kill the boy. Killing a child, even an inconvenient one, was a line the old lord wouldn't cross, or wouldn't be seen to cross, because a murdered child becomes a martyr, and a martyr is more dangerous than a living claimant. So they did the other thing, the thing that let them tell themselves they were merciful while doing something that I have come to think was its own kind of murder, slower, quieter, worse. They sealed him away. They hid the boy in the lower east wing in a small room, and they walled him in, not entirely. There was a way to bring him food. A small gap, a hatch, I remembered it as the memory came. A way to keep him alive, but walled in, hidden, erased. A living child sealed into the body of the fortress so that he was neither dead nor free, neither martyr nor threat, simply gone, vanished. A problem made to disappear behind stone. And I, 22, new, obedient, terrified of my hard lord and desperate to prove myself worthy of the guard, I was one of the men ordered to build the wall, to set the stones that sealed the boy in. I did it. That's the thing I walled up in myself for 40 years. I helped wall a child into the dark, on my lord's orders, when I was 22, and then I spent 40 years not remembering it so that I could go on being a man I could stand to be. I want to tell you about the building of the wall, the actual doing of it, because the details are what I'd buried deepest, and they're what I most deserve to carry now, out loud, where I can't bury them again. The boy was in the room when we walled it. That's the first thing. We didn't seal an empty room and put him in after. We built the wall with him on the other side of it, watching, and I have remembered now, God help me, I've remembered that he watched us do it. Through the shrinking gap as the wall rose, a small boy's face, watching the men build the stone that would seal him in, not understanding at first, and then understanding, and the understanding coming into his small face as the gap closed. The dawning horror of a child realizing what the grown men are doing to him, and I was one of the grown men, and I set stones while a child watched me seal him into the dark, and I did not stop, because I was 22 and terrified and ordered and a coward. And the wall went up and the boy's face disappeared behind the last stones, and then there was only the wall, and the sound of him behind it, crying, and then we left. I set the last stones. I remember that now too, the specific horror of it. It was me, my hands, that set the final stones, that closed the last of the gap, that put the boy fully into the dark. The other men had done their parts and it fell to me, the youngest, to finish it. And I finished it. I sealed a child into a wall with my own hands at 22 years old. And his crying was the last thing I heard as the last stone went in, muffled behind the stone, getting fainter as the wall thickened between us. A child crying behind a wall that I was building, that I built, that I finished. And then this is the part that is the true horror, worse even than the building. Then I walked away and I made myself forget. Not all at once. Over weeks, months, the young mind doing its terrible mercy, taking the unbearable thing and walling it up inside me the way I'd walled the boy up in the fortress, building stone over it in my own mind, brick by brick, memory by memory sealed away, until the thing was gone, until I genuinely did not know it had happened, until I could be Vale the decent, Vale with the clean conscience, Vale who'd never wronged a soul. I built 2 walls that year at 22. One of stone around a child in the fortress, and one of forgetting around the memory in myself. And the second wall held for 40 years, held so well that I became, on top of it, a genuinely good man, a trusted man, a man who'd have wept with honest horror to hear of someone doing what I had done. Because I didn't know I'd done it. The wall in my mind was perfect, and the perfection of it was the most damning thing of all, that I'd been able to seal away a sealed-away child so completely that I could mourn such crimes in the abstract while my own sat bricked up beneath my decency. The thing I can't forgive myself, the looking away, named fully. I have to dwell on the looking away, because it's the center of the center, the thing I most can't forgive, and a true confession doesn't flinch from its own worst stone. It would be one thing, not a good thing, but a different thing, if I'd walled the boy in without ever seeing him, if he'd been an abstraction, a task, stones to be set around a problem. Men do terrible things to abstractions. It's how most terrible things get done, by keeping the victim abstract, faceless, a category instead of a child. And if I could tell you I'd done it that way, blind, never seeing him, I'd still be guilty, but I'd be guilty the ordinary way, the way of men who do harm without looking at it. But that's not what happened. I looked at him. His eyes found mine. There was a moment, I've relived it 10,000 times since, a moment where the boy, through the shrinking gap, looked directly at me. The young guard setting the stones, and his eyes were not abstract. They were a specific child's specific eyes, frightened and pleading and not understanding why the men were doing this, and they found mine and held them. And in that moment I was not sealing an abstraction. I was being seen by a child I was sealing into the dark, and I had a choice, right then. The realest choice of my life, to stop, to meet that child's eyes and be unable to continue, to let the seeing stop the sealing, and I looked away. I broke the boy's gaze and looked at the stones and set the next one. I chose the stone over the child's eyes. I looked away so I could keep going. And that looking away is the thing I walled deepest and can't forgive. Because it wasn't ignorance and it wasn't pure helpless obedience. It was a choice to stop seeing him so I could finish killing him. And a man who looks away from a child's eyes in order to seal him in the dark is a man who knew, in that moment, exactly what he was doing, and did it anyway. And that man was me. And no amount of forgetting ever changed that it was me, and no amount of remembering will ever let me forgive it. That's why I tend the grave now and don't look away. Do you see? That's the shape of my penance, the logic of it. I looked away from the boy once in the moment that mattered most, and so now I do not look away, ever. I go to his grave every day and I look at it. I look at what I did. I keep my eyes on it the way I failed to keep my eyes on him, because the looking away was the sin, and the looking at is the only atonement that fits it. I can't undo the stone I set. I can't unkill him. But I can refuse, every day for the rest of my life, to look away again. And I do, I look. I make myself look at the grave, at the truth, at the worst thing I ever did, because I owe him my eyes now, the eyes I took away from him in the gap, and the only thing I have left to give is to never look away again. What became of the boy? You'll want to know, the way I needed to know, standing there with the wall half down and the memory all the way back. You'll want to know what was behind the stone. He died, of course he died. A child sealed in a wall does not survive, not for long, whatever gap they leave for food, and I learned, as the memory completed itself, and as I later in horror sought out the old records, that the feeding hadn't lasted, that within some weeks of the walling the old lord had simply stopped, had let the gap be sealed too, had let the boy starve in the dark once the immediate political need had passed, and the inconvenience of keeping a hidden child fed outweighed the small risk of letting him die. So the boy I'd walled in had died behind the stone, alone in the dark, slowly, a small claimant's son erased from the world by frightened men, and I had built the wall and then forgotten I'd built it, and behind the stone I was prying loose at 61 were the small remains of the child I'd helped seal there 40 years before. That's what the smell had been, the trace, the ghost. That's what the shoe had been. That's what was behind my wall. A child's bones, 40 years in the dark, behind a wall I built and forgot, and I was the one, of all the men in the fortress, of all the men in the world, I was the one sent with a crowbar to take it down and find him. I have asked myself 1,000 times since whether that was chance or something else. Whether it was only renovation, only a wall in the way of a doorway, only an old guard assigned to a work crew, or whether there's a thing in the world that brings us back in the end to the walls we built, that will not let us die with our worst thing still buried, that sends us, at 61, with a crowbar to the exact stone we set at 22. I don't know. I'm not a man who knows about such things. But I know that of all the walls in all the fortress, I was sent to that one, and that the sending broke open both walls at once, the stone and the forgetting, and that I came out from behind both of them, at 61, into the unbearable light of knowing exactly what I was. The collapse. I have to tell you about the collapse, because this is an identity collapse. This is the story of a man's whole self coming down, and the coming down is the heart of it. Understand what I lost standing there. Not just innocence, I lost the man. Veil the decent, veil the steady, veil with the clean 40-year conscience. That man had never existed. He was a fiction built on a buried atrocity, a good man with a sealed child beneath his goodness, and the instant the memory came back the good man died, because you cannot beveil the decent once you remember that veil walled a child into the dark. Everything I'd thought I was came apart at once. Every good deed of my 40 years, the young guards I'd counseled, the fights I'd broken up, the kindnesses, the steady decent record I'd polished like armor, all of it curdled in an instant because all of it had been built on top of the wall, had been, I saw now, perhaps because of the wall, the overcompensation of a man unconsciously trying to be good enough to outweigh a thing he couldn't remember, but that some deep part of him knew was there. My whole decency was a wall over a wall. My whole self was a construction sitting on top of a sealed child. And it all came down at once, in a corridor, with another man whistling beside me, and I stood in the rubble of 40 years of being someone, and I did not know who I was anymore, because the who I was had just been revealed as a lie I'd told myself to survive what I'd done. That's the collapse. Not grief exactly, though there was grief. Not guilt exactly, though the guilt was an ocean. It was the specific horror of identity collapse, the floor of the self giving way, the sudden total uncertainty of who you are when the person you'd always been turns out to have been built over a buried crime. I had been a good man for 40 years, and I had been the man who walled a child into the dark. And both were me, the same man, and I could not hold them both, and I could not let either go, and I stood in the corridor feeling my whole self come apart. The good veil and the monstrous veil grinding against each other with no resolution. No way to be one person. No way to be anyone at all. Just the wreckage of a self that had been a lie, and a crowbar in my hand, and a child's bones behind the last of the stone. The other men who else built the wall, and what became of them. There were other men at the wall that night 40 years ago. I was the youngest, the one who set the last stones, but I wasn't alone. There were others, older men, and I've thought about them since the collapse, about what became of them, about whether they buried it the way I did or carried it differently. Most were dead by the time I remembered. 40 years takes most men. But I found out what I could in the months of going through the old records, and what I found was its own kind of lesson. One of the older men had drunk himself to death within a few years of that night, and no one had known why. He'd been a steady man before, and then he wasn't. And he drank himself into the ground, and now I understand. He couldn't build the second wall, the forgetting one. His older mind couldn't do what my young one did. And so he had to live with the memory and couldn't. And the drink was how he walled it. The only way left to him, and it killed him. Another had left the guard entirely soon after, left the fortress. Left Tarn, gone, no one knew where. And I think now he ran from the place and the wall and the memory, tried to outrun it across distance the way I outran it across forgetting. And I hope, I don't know, but I hope he found some peace I didn't, though I doubt it. You don't outrun a thing like that, you only change which wall you build. So of the men who walled the boy in, one drank himself dead, one ran, and one me buried it so deep he became a good man on top of it for 40 years. 3 men, 3 different walls, 3 ways of not facing the same unbearable thing. And I've come to think we were all doing the same thing, the drinker and the runner and the forgetter, all building walls in ourselves around the same buried boy, all unable to simply face it, because it could not be faced, not then, not by the men we were, frightened and complicit and young. The only one who ever faced it was me, and only because a crowbar and a renovation and 40 years made it impossible not to, dragged me back to the wall and broke it open whether I willed it or not. None of us chose to face it. I didn't choose either. I was made to, by circumstance, by the wall coming down on its own. The difference between me and the drinker and the runner isn't that I was braver. It's that I was unluckier or luckier, depending how you see it, that my wall got pulled down while I was still alive to face what was behind it, and theirs stayed up until they died. I don't know if facing it was a mercy or a curse. I've said that before and I'll say it again because I still don't know. But I'm the only one of the 3 who ended at the boy's grave instead of in a bottle or a ditch in some far country. And maybe that's something. Maybe being made to face it, terrible as it was the only road that ended anywhere but ruin, even if where it ended was a grave I have to tend every day for the rest of my life. I did not tell the other man what I'd found, not at first. I covered it. I told him I was ill, which was true in every way that mattered, and I sent him off for water, for air, for anything, to be alone with the wall and the bones and the ruin of myself for a few minutes. And in those minutes I had to decide what to do, and the deciding was the next collapse, because every choice was impossible. I could rebury it. That was the first thought, the coward's thought, the 22-year-old's thought rising up in the 61-year-old. Seal it again, build the wall back, say nothing, let the dead wing be closed again, let Vale the decent be reburied with the boy, go back to being the good man, the clean conscience restored by a second forgetting. I could do it. No one knew. The other man hadn't seen. I could put the stones back and walk away and be, for the years I had left, the trusted old guard, and take the wall and the boy and the truth of myself to my grave. It would have been easy. It was, God forgive me, tempting, not because I wanted to escape punishment, I was past caring about punishment, but because I wanted to escape the knowing, wanted to go back to before, to not be the man who'd done this. And reburying it was the only road back to not knowing. And the not knowing had been so comfortable, 40 years so comfortable, and the knowing was unbearable, and I stood there with the stones in reach and genuinely, for a long, terrible moment. Considered building the wall back up and burying the child, a second time to save myself a second time. I didn't. I want to tell you I didn't out of pure conscience, but the truth is more tangled. Part of it was conscience, but part of it was simply that I couldn't, that having remembered I could not unremember by an act of will. The wall in my mind was down and would not go back up. I'd be the man who knew whether the stone wall stood or fell, and so reburying the boy would only mean being the man who knew and reburied him, which was worse somehow than being the man who revealed it. The second forgetting wasn't available to me. The young mind that could wall things off was 40 years gone. The old mind couldn't do it. So the choice to rebury wasn't really a choice to go back to innocence. There was no innocence to go back to. It was only a choice to add a second crime to the first. And even in my ruin I could see that, and so I didn't rebury him. I left the wall down. I left the boy uncovered. And I went to find the lord of the fortress to tell him what was behind the wall and what I had done. Telling the Lord was the hardest thing I ever did. Harder than the remembering, because the remembering happened to me, and the telling I had to choose again and again with every word. The Lord I served at the end was a young man, a good one, the grandson of the hard, frightened Lord who'd given the order 40 years before. And I had to stand in front of this good young Lord and tell him that his grandfather had sealed a child into a wall, and that I, his trusted old guard, the one he'd known his whole life as the steady, decent grandfather of the garrison, had built the wall with my own hands. I had to watch his face change. I had to watch the trust he'd had in me die in real time, watch him reassemble who I was in his eyes from Vale the decent to Vale the child killer. The same collapse I'd just undergone now happening in him, in his understanding of me, and it was its own particular agony to be the cause of it. To hand a good young man the ruin of his image of someone he trusted, to make him, too, lose a veil that had never really existed. He did not know what to do with me. How could he? The crime was 40 years old. The man who'd ordered it was long dead. The man who'd done it was his own trusted old guard, now confessing, ruined, asking for nothing. There was no law that fitted cleanly, no punishment that made sense. No precedent for an old man confessing to a forgotten atrocity he'd only just remembered committing. He could have had me executed. Part of me wanted it, the clean ending, the deserved ending. He could have had me imprisoned. He did neither in the end, and I'll tell you what he did, because it was wiser and harder than either, and it shaped the rest of my life. He made me responsible for the boy. That was his judgment when he'd thought it through, not death, not prison, but responsibility. He had the remains brought out from behind the wall properly with care, and he charged me, the man who'd sealed the boy in, with seeing the child properly buried at last, with finding out his name from the old records, with giving him the rest and the dignity and the remembrance he'd been denied for 40 years. You sealed him in the dark and forgot him, the Lord said. Now you will bring him into the light and remember him for the rest of your life. That is your sentence. Not to die for it. To live for it in service to the child you wronged until your own end. And I have done that. It's the only thing that's held me together since the collapse, the only thread out of the ruin. The work of remembering the boy, of being, for the rest of my days, the keeper of the child I killed. The young Lord's reckoning the full weight of telling him, and how he chose. I gave you the Lord's judgment fast, that he made me responsible for the boy rather than killing or jailing me. But the reckoning between us was longer and harder than that, and it deserves telling, because how he chose to handle me taught me something about justice I'd never understood. When I first told him, he didn't believe me. That was the first thing. A good young man cannot easily believe that his trusted old guard helped wall a child into the dark, and his first response was to think me mad, ill, confused, an old man's failing mind inventing horrors. And I had to convince him, had to take him to the wall, show him the opening, the remains, the records I'd begun to find, had to prove my own guilt to a man who didn't want to believe it, which is its own strange agony, arguing for your own damnation to someone who keeps trying to find you innocent. He kept offering me outs. You were young, you were ordered, you didn't know. Your grandfather's lord forced you, and I kept refusing them because I was done with outs, done with the walls, and I made him see that I would not be excused, that I had looked the boy in the eyes and looked away, that there was no out and I wanted none. I think that was when he finally believed me, when he saw that I was refusing every mercy he offered, because a man inventing a horror wants to be talked out of it, and I wanted only to be seen clearly, and the wanting to be seen clearly was the proof that it was real. And then he had to decide what to do with me, and I watched him struggle with it. This good young man handed an impossible thing, and the struggle taught me what justice actually is, as opposed to what I'd thought it was. I'd thought justice was punishment, that the just thing was to make me suffer in proportion to the crime, death for the death I'd caused. He saw further than that. He saw that my death would be easy, would be an out like all the others, would let me escape the one thing that was actually just, which was to live in full knowledge of what I'd done and to spend that life in service to the one I'd wronged. Killing me would end my reckoning. He wanted my reckoning not to end. So he chose the harder justice, the one that made me live, to remember, to tend, to serve the boy's memory until my own death, to carry the unresolvable every day rather than escape it through punishment. It was wiser than vengeance. Vengeance would have closed the account. He kept it open deliberately for the rest of my life, because an open account, a wound that doesn't close, was the only thing proportionate to a crime that could never be undone. I've served that sentence 15 years. It is far harder than death would have been, and far more just, and I've come to be grateful to that young lord for understanding justice better than I did, for sentencing me to truth instead of letting me off with death. I found his name. That was the first task and the hardest, going back through the old war records, the records of the dynastic struggle, looking for a small claimant's son taken and vanished. And it took months, and I found it, the boy's name, the name that hadn't been spoken in 40 years, the name of the child I'd walled into the dark, and I will not write it here, because it's his and I've spent 15 years now trying to give him back what was his, and I won't spend his name lightly. But I found it. And I had it carved on a real stone, over a real grave, in the light, in the open, where the fortress could see it and where I could come to it. And I buried the boy properly at last, 15 years ago now, with the young lord present and a few others who knew the truth. And me, the man who'd sealed him in, standing at the grave of the child I'd killed, having brought him at last out of the wall and into the light. And I have gone to that grave nearly every day for 15 years. That's the shape my life took after the collapse. I could not bewail the decent again. That man was gone, exposed as a fiction, and I did not try to rebuild him, because rebuilding him would have been building the wall again, the wall of forgetting, the comfortable lie. So I became someone else, someone new, someone I'm still not sure has a name. The old man who goes to the child's grave every day, who remembers, who has made remembering his whole remaining purpose, who does not let himself off, who does not seek to feel decent again, who simply tends the grave of the boy he killed and tries, in the only way left, to be of some use to a child it is 40 years too late to save. That's who I am now. Not a good man, not Vale the decent. Just a man who remembers on purpose, every day, the thing he once walled up, because the remembering is the only honest thing left to me and the only service I can still do the child. The burial, the day, and what it was to stand at the grave of the child I killed. The day we buried the boy properly, 15 years ago, was the strangest day of my life, and I have to give it to you, because it's the closest this story comes to grace, and even the grace is terrible. It was a small burial. It had to be, the full truth couldn't be made public. The old crime was too dangerous to the fortress's name even 40 years on, and so only a few knew, the young lord, a priest, 2 others, and me. We buried the remains in a real grave, in the fortress's burial ground, in the light, under the sky, with the boy's true name on the stone, the name I'd found in the records, the name that hadn't been spoken in 40 years. And I stood at that grave, the man who'd sealed him in, and I watched a child I'd killed be put properly into the earth at last, 40 years late, and the feeling was not relief and was not peace. It was something I don't have a word for, the feeling of doing a true thing that comes far too late to undo the false thing it answers, a right act 40 years downstream of a wrong one, unable to reach back and fix the wrong, only able to be right now, too late, while the wrong stands forever. The priest said the words for the dead, the words the boy should have had 40 years before and didn't, and I listened to a child finally getting his rights 4 decades late, and I wept the way I'd never wept in my life. And the young lord let me weep, didn't comfort me, because there was no comfort that fit and he was wise enough to know it. Just let the old murderer weep at the grave of the child he'd killed, because the weeping was true and the truth was the only thing left. And when it was done, when the boy was in the earth and the stone was set and the words were said, I made my vow silently at the grave, that I would come every day for the rest of my life, that I would not look away again, that I would be the keeper of this child's memory until I died, that I would never let him be forgotten or reburied or walled away a second time. And I have kept that vow, 15 years, nearly every day. The old man at the child's grave, looking, not looking away, keeping the one true thing he has left to keep. I want to say something about who I am now, because this is an identity collapse and you'll want to know whether the self rebuilt or broke, and the honest answer is neither or both, and I've made my peace with that. The old veil did not come back. He couldn't, he was a lie, and a new whole veil did not rise to replace him, some healed redeemed man at peace. That would be another lie, and I'm done with lies, the comfortable kind that let you live with yourself. What I am instead is a man who holds two things at once and does not resolve them. I am the man who walled a child into the dark at 22. And I am the man who has tended that child's grave every day for 15 years. Both, at once. Without resolution, without one canceling the other, without ever again getting to feel simply good or simply damned. The collapse didn't end in a new stable self. It ended in my learning to live broken, to carry the unresolvable, to be a man made of two facts that don't fit and never will. And I've come to think that this, the carrying of the unresolvable, the refusal to wall either fact away, is the only honest way to live once you've learned what you are. Not to rebuild the comfortable self, not to drown in the guilt, but to hold both every day and let neither be buried, and tend the grave and remember and not be at peace, because peace would mean I'd buried something again, and I will never bury anything again, not the boy, not the truth, not the unbearable shape of what I was. I'm telling you this now because I'm old, near my end, the real one this time, and when I die the last person who remembers the boy with full knowledge of what was done to him will be gone, and I can't bear for him to be reburied in forgetting a second time. So I've set it down. The whole of it. Not to be forgiven, I don't ask it, I don't think it's mine to receive. The boy can't forgive me and no one else has the standing. Not to feel better. Setting it down doesn't make me feel better, nothing makes me feel better. That's the point, that's the sentence, to not feel better ever, and to be honest about why. I've set it down only so the boy stays remembered, so that when I'm gone there's this, a record, a man's confession, the true account of a child sealed in a wall by a frightened young guard who then forgot, and remembered and spent his last years at the grave. Remember the boy. That's all I ask. Not for me, for him. He was small and he was sealed in the dark, and he watched the men build the wall, and one of the men was me, and he had a name, and he should not be forgotten again. Remember the boy. Let that be the use of this telling, the only use I'm fit to ask for. That one child, walled into the dark and forgotten for 40 years, is remembered now, by you, because an old man who could no longer bear his own buried wall finally pulled it down and told the truth. The years since, what a life of penance actually is, day by day. I should tell you what the years since have actually been, day by day, because penance in the abstract sounds almost noble and penance in the living is just gray. And I want you to have the gray truth of it, not a noble lie. It's not dramatic, a life of penance. It's a man getting old, going each day to a grave, sitting with it a while, sometimes talking to the stone, mostly just being there, looking, remembering, and then going back to his small life and his small duties and his bad sleep and his ruined sense of himself, and doing it again the next day and the next, for 15 years. There's no catharsis. That's the thing I most want to be honest about. The penance doesn't build to anything, doesn't heal me, doesn't earn me back my decency or my peace. It's not a road to feeling better, it's the opposite. It's a daily refusal to feel better, a daily return to the worst thing, a daily looking at what I did. And it's gray and it's hard, and most days it's just heavy, just the weight of it, carried to the grave and back, carried into sleep and out of it, carried into old age and toward death. That's penance. Not a grand redemptive arc. Just a man carrying a thing he can never put down every day on purpose, because putting it down would mean walling it away again, and he's done with walls. But I'll tell you the one thing the years have given me, the only thing, because it's true and I won't leave it out. The boy is not forgotten anymore. For 40 years he was forgotten, walled away in stone and in my mind, erased from the world as completely as frightened men could erase him. And now he is remembered by me, every day, and by the few who know, and now by you, reading this. He has a name on a stone in the light. He has a man who comes to his grave. He has, at last, 40 years too late, a place in the world's memory, a small place but real, and that place exists because the wall came down and I didn't look away. I can't give him his life. I took that and nothing gives it back. But I gave him his memory, his name, his grave, his place in the light, and a keeper who won't look away, and that's not nothing, even if it's 40 years too late, even if it doesn't redeem me, even if I'm still the man who walled him in. The boy is remembered now. That's the only thing my ruined life produced that was worth producing. And when I die, this telling will remember him after me, will be the wall pulled down again for whoever reads it, the truth let out into the light one more time, so that even when the old man at the grave is gone, the boy stays remembered, stays in the light, never walled away again. That's all I have. It's not enough. Nothing is enough. But it's true, and it's his, and I give it to him, the only gift the man who killed him has left, to make sure the world remembers there was a child, and he had a name, and he should never have been put in the dark. There's a thing I've learned at the end that I'll leave you with, because it's the truest thing the wall taught me, and it's bigger than me. We all have walls. Not all of us walled a child into the dark. I pray to whatever's listening that very few of us did anything so terrible. But all of us have things we've sealed away inside ourselves to keep being able to live, things we've walled off so we can like who we are, and most of us go our whole lives without the renovation that brings the wall down, without the crowbar and the smell and the memory pouring back, and we die with the walls still standing, never knowing what was behind them, good men and women to the end on top of buried things. I don't know if that's a mercy or a curse, to die with the wall still up. I used to think, in my first agony after the collapse, that it would have been better never to remember, better to die as Vale the decent, the buried thing buried forever. I don't think that anymore. I think the wall coming down, terrible as it was the only thing that ever made me real. Vale the decent was a fiction, comfortable and false. The broken man at the grave is true. And I would rather be true and ruined than false and comfortable, now at the end, though it cost me everything I thought I was, because the boy deserved one person who knew the truth and faced it. He got that late, too late, but he got it. One man pulled down the wall and looked at what he'd done and did not look away again. It doesn't save the boy. Nothing saves the boy. But it's the only thing I had left to give him, and I gave it, and I'd give it again, the terrible gift of being true, the pulling down of the wall, the refusal to die comfortable on top of a buried child. So if you take one thing from an old ruined man's confession, take this. Be careful what you wall up inside yourself to keep liking who you are. The wall holds. It holds for 40 years. It lets you be good on top of buried things. But the renovation comes in the end one way or another. The crowbar finds the wall, and what's behind it is still there, exactly as you left it, waiting, patient as stone, for you to come back and remember. Better to face the thing before the wall goes up. Better to be true and troubled than false and at peace. I learned it too late to save a child. Maybe you'll learn it in time to save yourself. That's the only good I can still do in the world, I think, to tell you about the walls, mine and yours, and to beg you not to build them. Because behind every wall a frightened person builds inside themselves there is some version of a child in the dark, and the child waits, and the wall comes down eventually, and then you have to know what you are, and it is better, it is so much better, to know it before you've built your whole life on top of not knowing. There was a wall in the fortress of Okmar. I built it at 22, around a child, on a frightened lord's orders, and then I built a second wall in myself, around the memory, and I was a good man for 40 years on top of that buried boy. And then they sent me, at 61, with a crowbar to pull the wall down, and both walls came down at once, and I learned what I was, and I have spent the years since at the grave of the child I killed, not good, not forgiven, not at peace, but true, finally true, for the first time in my life. His name is carved on a stone in the light now. I put it there. It's the only thing I ever did that I don't have to wall away. Remember the boy. Set down by Vale, once a guardsman of Alkmaar in the kingdom of Tarn, who walled a child into the dark and forgot, and remembered, and told the truth at last, and asks only that the child be remembered and not the man.